For a long time, people wanted this story to be simple. One person to blame. One clear villain. One obvious line where everything went wrong. But the longer you look at what happened with Timmy's custody, the harder it is to ignore that responsibility doesn't sit with just one person. It stretches. It overlaps. And it becomes shared. From the beginning, Eric and Patrick positioned themselves as helpers. That was the role they presented to the public. They talked about concern. They talked about safety. They talked about doing what was best. And at first, many people believed that. It felt reassuring to think someone had stepped in with good intentions. But intentions are only part of the story. Actions matter more. And decisions made together carry shared weight. Eric was loud. Strategic. He spoke often, planned openly, and pushed narratives forward. Patrick, on the other hand, appeared quieter, more passive, more reserved. And that contrast made it easy for people to assume that one was leading while the other was simply following. But silence is not the same as innocence. Standing beside something, watching it unfold, and allowing it to continue is still participation. Timmy's custody didn't change in a vacuum. It didn't happen overnight because of one phone call or one report. It happened after weeks and months of conversations, planning, messaging, and framing. Both Eric and Patrick were present during that time. Both had access. Both had influence. And both benefited from the outcome in different ways. Eric's role has been dissected endlessly. His words, his plans, his statements have all been scrutinized. But Patrick's role often gets minimized, framed as someone who didn't stop it, rather than someone who helped allow it. That distinction matters. Not stopping something harmful when you have the ability to question it, slow it down, or refuse to participate is still a choice. There were moments when Patrick could have spoken up. Moments when he could have challenged the direction things were going. Moments when he could have said, "This isn't right," or "This is going too far." Instead, he stayed aligned. He validated decisions through presence alone. And that alignment gave Eric credibility and cover. Shared responsibility doesn't mean identical behavior. It doesn't mean both people did the same things. It means that one person's actions were enabled, reinforced, or made possible by the other's cooperation. Eric pushed. Patrick permitted. Eric escalated. Patrick stayed. Together, that created momentum that couldn't easily be undone. And then there's the issue of benefit. Custody conversations weren't abstract. They came with attention, control, access, and influence. Even if motivations differed, both stood to gain something from being positioned close to Timmy's future. Whether that gain was emotional, reputational, or practical, it existed. And when benefit enters the picture, accountability must follow. Another uncomfortable truth is that public perception played a role. Eric was willing to be confrontational. Patrick often appeared calmer, more grounded. That contrast helped sell the narrative. One looked intense, the other looked steady. Together, they created balance that made the story easier for outsiders to accept. That wasn't accidental. That dynamic worked in their favor. Timmy, meanwhile, was not directing any of this. He was not advocating for custody changes. He wasn't campaigning for new guardians. Decisions were being made around him, about him, without his understanding or control. And when adults make choices for someone who cannot fully consent or comprehend the consequences, the burden of responsibility becomes heavier, not lighter. There's also the matter of escalation. Once the idea of custody entered the conversation, everything else began to shift. Language hardened. Situations were reframed. Ordinary moments were reinterpreted as risks or failures. That reframing didn't come from one voice alone. It required agreement, reinforcement, and repetition. It required more than one person deciding to move forward instead of stepping back. Patrick's continued presence sent a message that this course of action was acceptable, that it was justified, that it was necessary. Even without leading, that message mattered, especially to authorities, supporters, and observers who assumed that two adults agreeing meant the situation must be serious. Shared responsibility also means shared consequences. Even now, as people argue about who did what, the outcome remains the same. Timmy's life was altered. His stability was disrupted. His future became uncertain. And those effects don't disappear just because blame is disputed. They exist regardless of intent. This isn't about demonizing one person or absolving another. It's about acknowledging that when two people move together toward a decision, they own the direction it takes. Patrick didn't have to be the architect to be accountable. He only had to stay involved long enough for his presence to matter. As this story continues to unfold, the question isn't just who started it. The real question is, who allowed it to continue? And when you look honestly at the timeline, the conversations, and the alignment between Eric and Patrick, it becomes clear that responsibility does not belong to one name alone. Timmy's custody didn't change because of a single action. It changed because multiple adults made choices that pushed the same outcome forward. And until that shared responsibility is acknowledged, the full truth of what happened will remain incomplete. If you've been following this story, what do you think? Does responsibility stop with the loudest voice, or does it include the ones who stood beside it? Share your thoughts in the comments. As the situation moved forward, the idea that responsibility could be neatly divided began to fall apart. What started as concern gradually turned into coordination. Decisions weren't being made in isolation anymore. Conversations overlapped. Narratives aligned. And once that alignment happened, it became impossible to separate who was merely present from who was actively participating. One of the most overlooked aspects of shared responsibility is momentum. Momentum doesn't come from one person alone. It builds when others don't interrupt it. Eric's actions gained traction because Patrick remained beside him while they unfolded. That mattered. It meant that objections were absent. It meant doubts weren't voiced publicly. People often assume that the loudest person carries the most blame. But in real situations, especially ones involving power and control, it's often the quiet cooperation that allows things to go further than they should. Patrick didn't need to issue ultimatums or make public declarations. His continued involvement did the work for him. It normalized what was happening. There were multiple moments where the situation could have slowed down. Moments when someone could have said, "Let's pause," or "This doesn't feel right," or even, "This isn't our place." Those moments passed without resistance. Each time that happened, the path forward became more fixed. And each step taken together made it harder to turn back. It's also important to recognize how authority is perceived. When two adults present a united front, especially in matters involving custody, care, or protection, their claims carry more weight. Officials listen differently. Supporters respond differently. Even critics hesitate more. Eric didn't just have his own voice, he had reinforcement. And that reinforcement amplified everything. Patrick's role often gets framed as emotional rather than strategic. But emotional involvement doesn't negate responsibility. In fact, it can deepen it. When someone claims they stayed because they cared, that care becomes inseparable from the outcomes that followed. Caring doesn't excuse harm. It demands accountability when harm occurs. There's also the question of knowledge. Patrick wasn't unaware of what was happening. He heard the conversations. He saw the plans forming. He watched as situations were reframed and escalated. Continued participation under those circumstances isn't passive, it's informed. And informed participation carries responsibility. Another layer that complicates this is the way public sympathy was managed. Eric's intensity often drew criticism, while Patrick's calmer demeanor softened the image. That contrast wasn't accidental in its effect. It created balance. It made the situation seem less extreme than it was. And that balance helped deflect scrutiny at critical moments. When people say, "Patrick didn't do anything," what they often mean is, "Patrick didn't do anything visible." But invisibility doesn't erase impact. Standing next to power while it acts is still influence. Remaining silent while decisions are made is still consent. Timmy's voice was never the loudest in this story. It was overshadowed by adult narratives, adult fears, and adult agendas. That alone should have raised red flags. Instead, it became another justification for moving forward without slowing down. And when one person pushes while another agrees, even quietly, the result is the same: the child's agency disappears. There's also the emotional aftermath to consider. When the situation began to unravel and questions started piling up, Patrick didn't immediately distance himself from the choices made. He didn't publicly challenge the process or express regret in a way that would suggest opposition. That absence of pushback reinforces the idea that, at the time, the direction felt acceptable to him. Shared responsibility doesn't require shared intent. Eric may have been driven by control, ambition, or outcome. Patrick may have been driven by loyalty, fear, or belief. But intent doesn't change effect. Two people can arrive at the same harmful outcome for different reasons and still be accountable together. This is where the narrative often becomes uncomfortable. People want to believe that someone stayed quiet because they were manipulated or intimidated. And sometimes that's true. But intimidation doesn't erase agency entirely. Especially not over extended periods. Especially not when there are repeated opportunities to step away. At some point, staying becomes a choice. Endorsing becomes a choice. Allowing becomes a choice. And choices made repeatedly turn into responsibility, whether or not that responsibility was ever acknowledged. The deeper this situation is examined, the clearer it becomes that focusing on one person alone simplifies a story that is anything but simple. Eric may have initiated, but Patrick's continued alignment gave the process legitimacy. It told others, "This is okay." And once that message is sent, it can't be taken back. Timmy's custody didn't shift because of a single act. It shifted because multiple adults failed to put the brakes on something that should have been questioned at every step. And when people ask how it got so far, the answer lies not just in who pushed hardest, but in who stood close enough to let it happen. What do you think? Does silence equal consent in situations like this? Or does shared presence automatically mean shared responsibility? Leave your thoughts in the comments. As time passed, the consequences of shared involvement became harder to ignore. What once looked like concern or support started to resemble something else entirely: reinforcement. When actions are repeated, echoed, and defended, they stop being reactions and start becoming a pattern. And patterns tell a much clearer story than any single explanation ever could. One of the most damaging aspects of this situation was how certainty replaced caution. Early on, there should have been uncertainty, questions, hesitation, even discomfort. Instead, confidence grew. Statements became firmer. Assumptions hardened into conclusions. That shift didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because more than one person was feeding it. When one person asserts a version of events and another echoes it, the story gains weight. It starts to feel settled, even when it isn't. And once a narrative feels settled, it becomes easier to justify drastic actions. At that point, the focus shifts away from asking whether something should be done and moves toward how fast it can be done. That's where shared responsibility becomes undeniable. Patrick's presence during key moments didn't just add support, it reduced friction. Friction is what slows bad decisions. Friction is what forces people to rethink. Without it, momentum builds unchecked. Eric didn't face meaningful resistance from the person closest to him, and that absence mattered more than any single statement Patrick did or didn't make. There's also the issue of credibility by association. Patrick was viewed by many as calmer, more grounded, less extreme. That perception mattered. When someone like that stands beside someone acting aggressively or decisively, it reassures observers. It sends a signal that things are under control, that concerns are justified, and that the course of action is. People trusted what they were seeing because it didn't look chaotic. Two adults working together, seemingly aligned, discussing what's best, can easily overshadow the uncomfortable reality that the person most affected had little say. The appearance of stability replaced the need for scrutiny. Another layer of responsibility comes from how information was framed. When events were discussed, they weren't presented as possibilities, they were presented as facts. When concerns were raised, they were reframed as dangers. And when doubt appeared, it was often dismissed as ignorance or hostility. That framing didn't come from one person alone. It was reinforced. Patrick's agreement, even when subtle, helped lock those frames in place. There's a tendency to excuse quiet participants by assuming they lacked power. But power isn't only about control, it's about influence. Patrick didn't need to be in charge to matter. His proximity gave legitimacy. His continued presence validated decisions. And his lack of objection removed one of the last internal checks on what was happening. Timmy's needs were repeatedly discussed, but his autonomy was rarely centered. Instead, adults spoke for him, about him, and over him. That dynamic alone should have caused alarm. Instead, it became normalized. And normalization only happens when multiple people accept it as standard. Another uncomfortable truth is that benefits were not evenly distributed. Attention increased. Platforms grew. Narratives became content. And while not everyone sought the same outcomes, everyone involved gained something, whether it was relevance, validation, or a sense of purpose. When personal gain enters the picture, responsibility deepens. That doesn't require malicious intent. It only requires awareness. And awareness was present. At no point was Patrick cut off from information. He wasn't in the dark. He wasn't excluded. He was there for the planning, the execution, and the aftermath. Remaining involved through all three stages removes plausible deniability. By the time things escalated, staying silent became a choice rather than a reaction. Some argue that Patrick was conflicted, that he didn't know how to stop things once they were in motion. But conflict doesn't absolve responsibility. In fact, it highlights it. Knowing something feels wrong and continuing anyway is often more telling than acting without reflection. There's also the matter of timing. Responsibility isn't just about what happened, it's about when nothing happened. When opportunities arose to slow down, to consult neutral parties, to center Timmy's voice, those opportunities passed. Each missed chance reinforced the trajectory. And when outcomes became irreversible, shared responsibility became unavoidable. It's easy to point to the person who spoke the loudest or acted the fastest. It's harder to examine the people who stood close enough to make those actions possible. But accountability doesn't stop at volume. It extends to proximity, participation, and persistence. Timmy's custody outcome didn't result from a single betrayal. It resulted from sustained alignment, from repeated agreement, from a lack of meaningful resistance, and from two adults choosing to move forward together instead of stopping to question whether they should move at all. That shared path is what binds responsibility. When history looks back on situations like this, it rarely separates participants by who meant well and who didn't. It looks at outcomes. It looks at who had power, who had influence, and who failed to intervene when intervention mattered most. And in that context, Patrick's role cannot be dismissed as incidental. Do you believe responsibility is shared when one person leads and another enables? Or should accountability fall only on the one who pushed hardest? Share your thoughts in the comments. By the time everything reached a breaking point, the damage was no longer theoretical. It was real, lived, and irreversible. And this is where the conversation about responsibility becomes even more uncomfortable, because it's no longer about intent, personality, or even motive. It's about outcome. Once a child is removed from the only environment they've ever known, there is no undo button. You can't rewind confusion. You can't reverse fear. You can't restore trust by saying, "That wasn't my idea," or "I didn't think it would go this far." What matters is that it did go that far, and multiple people helped it get there. At this stage, silence became louder than words. After the initial actions were taken, after authorities were involved, after the separation occurred, there was still time to intervene. There were moments when someone could have stepped forward and said, "This isn't right," or "We need to pause," or even, "We need independent oversight." But those moments passed without challenge. And passing on those moments carries weight. Patrick's continued alignment after the fact matters just as much as his alignment before it. Remaining present, continuing to justify, continuing to frame events as necessary or inevitable, those choices helped lock the situation in place. When no one close to Eric publicly or privately questioned the process, it sent a clear message: this was acceptable. That message didn't just affect outsiders. It affected institutions. When authorities see unified narratives, they are less likely to question them. When concerns are repeated consistently by more than one source, they appear corroborated. When objections are absent, urgency increases. Patrick's role in reinforcing the story, directly or indirectly, added legitimacy that may not have existed otherwise. This isn't about who filed paperwork or made phone calls. It's about who helped create the environment in which those actions felt justified. Another critical piece of responsibility lies in what wasn't disclosed. Information was selectively shared, framed to emphasize danger while minimizing stability. Long-standing routines were ignored. Emotional bonds were treated as secondary. And once again, this wasn't the work of one person alone. Patrick didn't challenge those omissions. He didn't demand balance. He didn't insist that context be preserved. By allowing one-sided narratives to dominate, he became part of the mechanism that stripped Timmy of agency. There's also the issue of benefit after the fact. Attention increased. Discussions multiplied. Platforms expanded. And while some people may argue that no one intended harm, it's impossible to ignore that visibility and influence grew as the situation worsened. When crisis becomes content, responsibility deepens. Remaining involved while benefiting, even indirectly, means accepting a share of accountability. Some defenders argue that Patrick eventually distanced himself. But distance after impact does not negate participation before or during. Walking away once consequences appear doesn't erase earlier support. In many cases, it reinforces the harm by leaving those affected to deal with the fallout alone. And then there's the matter of Timmy himself. At no point did Timmy drive this process. He did not initiate it. He did not consent to it. He did not understand the full scope of what was happening. Decisions were made around him, for him and over him, by adults claiming to know what was best. That dynamic demands a higher ethical standard, not a lower one. Patrick knew Timmy's limitations. He knew his dependence on familiarity. He knew the weight of disruption. That knowledge increases responsibility, not reduces it. When someone understands vulnerability and still supports actions that destabilize it, neutrality is no longer an option. There's a tendency to excuse secondary figures by framing them as followers. But followers still choose where they stand. And in moments like these, where a single objection could have slowed everything down. Choosing alignment over resistance is a decision with consequences. Shared responsibility doesn't mean equal responsibility, but it does mean meaningful responsibility. Eric may have driven the process. He may have pushed hardest, but Patrick helped clear the road. He validated concerns without demanding proof. He reinforced urgency without insisting on safeguards. And he stayed present long enough for irreversible steps to be taken. That matters. When people ask why accountability feels incomplete, this is why. Because focusing on one person oversimplifies a situation that required cooperation to succeed. No system acts on a single voice alone. It responds to patterns, consistency, and reinforcement. Patrick was part of that reinforcement. And until that role is acknowledged honestly, the conversation will remain stalled. Healing can't begin where responsibility is deflected. Justice can't exist where participation is minimized. And clarity can't emerge while silence is treated as innocence. This isn't about punishment. It's about truth. Truth means recognizing that Timmy's custody outcome was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, and not the result of one rogue actor. It was the result of shared decisions, shared narratives, and shared failures to protect the most vulnerable person involved. And shared responsibility must be named before anything else can move forward. Do you believe silence and reinforcement carry as much responsibility as action itself? Or should accountability only fall on the person who initiated everything? Share your thoughts in the comments. By the time everything settled into what people now call the outcome, the hardest truth became impossible to avoid. This wasn't just a failure of judgment. It was a failure of restraint, accountability, and moral courage, spread across more than one person. Shared responsibility doesn't mean everyone carried the same weight. It means everyone who had influence carried some weight. And in this case, influence wasn't abstract. It was personal. It was proximity. It was access. It was trust. Patrick was not a stranger watching from afar. He wasn't a random commenter or an outsider reacting after the fact. He was close enough to see the inner workings. Close enough to hear doubts when cameras were off. Close enough to know when fear was being amplified instead of examined. Close enough to recognize when lines were being crossed. That closeness is what makes neutrality impossible. When someone witnesses escalation and chooses not to interrupt it, they don't remain neutral, they become stabilizers of the escalation itself. Their presence reassures the person driving events that they're not alone, not reckless, not overreaching. Silence, in those moments, becomes permission. And permission changes everything. What makes Timmy's custody especially troubling isn't only the end result, but how predictable that result was. Anyone with basic understanding of trauma, disability, or dependency could see where this path was leading. Disruption, confusion, fear, detachment, loss of trust. These aren't rare outcomes, they're expected ones. Patrick knew this. He knew Timmy's world was small, structured, and deeply rooted in routine. He knew change wasn't just uncomfortable, it was destabilizing. And yet, he continued to align himself with decisions that shattered that structure, without demanding safeguards or slowing the process. Even worse, he participated in narratives that reframed upheaval as rescue. That framing matters. When disruption is labeled rescue, questioning it becomes taboo. When urgency is framed as necessity, hesitation becomes villainized. And when fear is used as justification, the people being saved lose their voice entirely. Patrick didn't create that framing, but he reinforced it. There were multiple moments where intervention could have occurred. Moments where someone could have said, "This needs review," or "This needs independent input," or even, "This isn't moving in the right direction." None of those things happened. Instead, momentum was protected. And momentum, once it reaches institutions, becomes extremely difficult to stop. Systems respond to consistency, to confidence, to repeated messaging. When more than one adult presents the same concern, the system assumes legitimacy. When no one close contradicts the narrative, the system escalates. Patrick's role in maintaining that consistency mattered. His agreement, spoken or implied, made the story stronger. His lack of resistance made the process smoother. And his continued presence lent credibility where skepticism should have existed. Some argue that Patrick was misled, that he trusted the wrong person, that he didn't realize the full scope of what was happening until it was too late. But being misled doesn't absolve someone who had the power to ask questions and chose not to. Trust is not an excuse for abandoning responsibility, especially when a vulnerable person is involved. In fact, trust increases responsibility. It demands verification. It demands caution. It demands boundaries. None of those demands were met. There's also the issue of timing. Responsibility isn't only about what someone does. At that stage, Patrick still didn't intervene. Even after separation occurred, there was opportunity to advocate for reunification, transparency, or reassessment. Opportunity to publicly state concern. Opportunity to distance himself before the damage became permanent. Those opportunities passed. And what followed instead was withdrawal, quiet, unexplained, and incomplete. Withdrawal without accountability doesn't undo harm. It leaves questions unanswered. It leaves narratives unchallenged. And it leaves the most affected person, Timmy, without an advocate from someone who once claimed to care deeply. That absence is part of the harm. Because when the people closest to a situation disappear, the system doesn't stop. It assumes resolution. It assumes consensus. It assumes success. And that assumption becomes the official record. This is why shared responsibility must be acknowledged openly. Not to punish. Not to vilify. But to understand how easily harm can be enabled by cooperation, compliance, and silence. Timmy didn't need saviors. He needed protectors. Protectors don't rush. They don't dramatize. They don't override familiarity with ideology. They don't mistake control for care. And they don't stand by when systems move faster than understanding. Patrick had the chance to be a protector. Instead, he became part of a process that removed Timmy's autonomy, fractured his world, and left lasting damage that no one has fully answered for. That doesn't make him the sole villain. But it does make him responsible. And responsibility doesn't disappear just because someone else pushed harder. If there is any hope of learning from this, it starts with honesty about how influence works, how silence functions, and how easily good intentions can become weapons when unchecked. It also requires acknowledging that shared responsibility is not an attack. It's an invitation to accountability, to growth, to preventing this from happening again. Because the most dangerous belief in situations like this is that harm only comes from one person. It doesn't. It comes from alignment without scrutiny, from loyalty without limits, from trust without verification, from silence when a voice is needed most. Timmy deserved better than that. And until everyone who played a role, direct or indirect, owns their part, the story remains unfinished. Do you believe responsibility should extend to those who enabled the process, not just the person who led it? Or do you think only the initiators should be held accountable? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.